Okay, this is a lecture for my second hour class on the 22nd of March. Excuse me, not 22nd of May, 22nd of March. Okay, well, when we left off the other day, and we were about to start talking about the Second Reconstruction, as the modern day civil rights movement is often called. That's what Dr. Martin Luther King often referred to it as. The civil rights movement, the modern day civil rights movement that is still ongoing today, began during the Eisenhower administration. There's a saying that says there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. You may object to the idea, you may not like the idea, but when an idea's time has come, it's unstoppable. And I think that's what you could say about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, ongoing, as I say today. I don't care if you're talking about gays in the military, same-sex marriage, healthcare, transgender rights. All of those are issues that society is dealing with today. And of course, many of them are gays in the military, same-sex marriage is the law of the land now. A lot of people may object to that. A lot of people may not like that. Courts have ruled, and that is the law in the United States, because those are ideas. Those are perfect examples of what I'm talking about. Those are ideas whose time has come. And when, in regard to the civil rights movement, the modern day civil rights movement, that again, we're still in, World War II was the catalyst, okay, for that, the catalyst. And catalyst means the beginning point. The catalyst, okay? It's the thing that kicked off World War II, was the thing that kicked off the modern day civil rights movement, because African Americans, by the hundreds of thousands, had gone overseas, both in the Pacific War and the European War, and they had fought alongside white Americans and white Britons and so forth. They had fought alongside whites in this epic struggle between liberty and tyranny. And as I say, a lot of them had served in Europe. In fact, I believe the majority of African Americans who fought in World War II did serve in Europe. And when they got to Europe, when they got to places like England, they discovered that European attitudes, England and France, European attitudes toward race were markedly different than they were here in the United States. They came from the United States, where everything was segregated, where lynching went on a fairly regular basis. And when they got to Europe, they were accepted as equals. In fact, in England, they would give dances for when the American soldiers started arriving by the thousands. They would give dances for American soldiers or American GIs, and on occasion, blacks would come to those dances, black soldiers, and they would dance with white English girls. White English girls had no problem dancing with black men. It just wasn't even an issue. And there were a couple of riots in London where white soldiers so objected to seeing white girls dance with black men that they attacked these black GIs, and it turned into a riot. So anyway, these African-American soldiers who had fought in the war, especially those who went to Europe, they experienced as I say, a markedly different attitude about race or toward race in Europe. And when they came home, having sacrificed their lives for the United States, they demanded equality. They said the time has come. This was 90 years after the Civil War. This was 90 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And still African Americans were not equal. And they said, we put our life on the line to preserve this republic like everyone else, and we demand equality. In fact, shortly after World War II, President Truman, as you know, had integrated the United States military by executive order. Presidents can issue executive orders. Congress would have never, if Truman would have sent a bill over to the Congress saying, I want to integrate the military, by the way, the military was strictly segregated, Congress would have never approved that. And the thing, of course, that moved Truman to issue this executive order as Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces to integrate the armed forces was this man right here. A sergeant, you can see, from World War II. His name was Isaac Wood. He was from the town of Let me check this and see if it's still taking here. Yes, still taking. Okay. Sergeant Isaac Wood, he was from Aiken, South Carolina. I think I may have told you this story before, but here he is. And he had come home after serving from World War II. He had come home. He had been honorably discharged for his service in World War II, and 3 hours, and then got on a bus to go home to Aiken, South Carolina, and his family that he had not seen in 3 years. And 3 hours after he was discharged, his bus arrived in Aiken, South Carolina, and he started to get off the bus, and the white bus driver, said something to him, and he turned to answer. And of course, there's his family. I think you can imagine how excited they are and how excited he was. And he turns to answer the bus driver's question, and instead of saying yes, sir, he just said yes. He didn't put sir to it. And he was immediately apprehended by this man, Sheriff Linwood Shull. You don't have to write him down, but I just want you to see him. And Linwood Shull pulled a pair. He's the sheriff of the county. This is the person who's responsible for enforcing the law for all the citizens of the county. And he pulled a pair of needle-nosed pliers out of his pocket, and he gouged out the eyes. And here is, here is, if you can see it, those of you out in TV land, here is Sergeant Isaac Wood. He lost his sight 3 hours after being discharged from the army that he had served in to help defeat Hitler and Tojo and to save liberty in the world. And of course, there was a trial over this, okay? There was a trial. And Shull, the county sheriff, was tried for gouging out the eyes of this man. And in his closing arguments before an all-white jury in South Carolina, Shull, this is the sheriff, this is the man that had done this to this man. Shull's attorney said this to the jury. He said, if you do not find this man, Sheriff Shull, innocent, and if the U.S. government, because this was so outrageous that people in the U.S. government, the Justice Department, were saying, if the Justice Department has ever intervened in a case, it has to intervene in this. So he said, to the jury, if you do not find this man guilty, or innocent, excuse me, and if the U.S. government attempts to prosecute Sheriff Shull, then South Carolina ought to secede from the Union, okay? Ought to secede from the Union again, okay? That was the attitude. And of course, the case was never in doubt. The all-white jury will retire to the jury room, and just in a matter of minutes, they will come back with a verdict of not guilty. And when the jury foreman announced not guilty, the entire courtroom stood up and applauded, okay? So that's the status of civil rights. That's not a little example. That's an example of the status of civil rights in this country at the end of World War II. And so Truman read of that. Truman was informed of that, and he said, "Now is the time to act." And he integrated the military. And by the way, when Truman I just want to let you understand this. When Truman issued that order, a lot of officers resigned. A lot of people criticized Truman, and they said putting black and white soldiers in the same mess halls, chow halls, in the same trenches, in the same foxholes, in the same barracks will destroy the esprit de corps of the Army. The esprit de corps is the fighting spirit of the Army. Whites, they said, would never eat, sleep, shower, or serve in a foxhole with black soldiers. It would just never happen. It would destroy the Army. In fact, that is the same argument used by those in 2016 who opposed homosexuals and transgender soldiers serving openly in the military. Homosexuals have always served in the U.S. military. You can go all the way back to 1778, and Baron von Steuben, who's called the father of the American Army. He was a German immigrant who came here and fought, and literally he was a professional soldier, trained our army. He was homosexual. So homosexuals have always served, but now, since 2016, they have been allowed to serve openly. And the president, who, as commander-in-chief, issued that, we had talked about that for years, but the president who issued the executive order saying that now homosexuals couldn't be discharged, could serve openly in the Army was President Barack Obama. If he would have sent that to the Congress, just like Truman, if he'd have sent that to the Congress, it would have never passed. And he knew it, and so he issued an executive order. By the way, he waited until his second term. He knew he would never run another political campaign, but still, he issued that order. When we went to war right after 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq, we threw out of the Army 38 Arab speakers. It would seem pretty important to have people who spoke Arab fluently if we're going to war in the Middle East, which is predominantly ethnically Arab. But we threw those men out, and I suspect some of them were men and women out because of their sexual orientation. While the United States up until 2016 did not allow homosexuals to serve openly in the Army, our allies did. If you were all here, Miss Lewis is the only one here, so I'm not going to pick on her today, but if you were all here, I would ask you the question, who is the Army that the United States likes the best? When we go to war, who are our best friends in war? Well, the answer to that is it's England. I didn't say they're the greatest Army. I'm just saying they're the ones that we like the best. And while we denied up until 2016 homosexuals to serve in the Army, the British have allowed that since 2000. But the Army we admire the most, now that's the Army we like the most, the Army we admire the most is the Israeli Army, and homosexuals have been allowed to serve openly in the Israeli Army since 1993. The French, the Germans, the Italians, Mexico, Canada, all of those were way ahead of the United States when it came to allowing gays to serve in the military. Their attitude was, if you're a citizen of this country and you want to serve this country, you want to put your life on the line for this country, we will gladly accept you. We didn't come to that attitude. It took an executive order in 2016. The same thing with African Americans. And by the way, African Americans had served in all of our wars. They just couldn't serve until the Civil War. They could not serve as a part of the United States Army. Okay, but in the Civil War that changed. But still, they were strictly segregated. So 100 years after the Civil War, African Americans in this country, or 90 years during the Eisenhower administration, the 1950s, African Americans still attended segregated schools and universities and stores. Department stores were segregated. Restaurants, hospitals, swimming pools, drinking fountains, movie theaters, prisons, athletic fields, even our sports. You had a Negro League versus the American League and the National League in both football, professional football, and baseball. You follow high school was segregated with white-eye. Go look at the senior panels down there in the 1950s. You won't see any black faces if you follow high school. The university, same with the University of Oklahoma, same with East Central, same with Northeastern, same with Oklahoma State. You can go right down the list. There was one university that African Americans could attend in Oklahoma when Dwight Eisenhower was, by the time Dwight Eisenhower was president, and it was in Guthrie, it was Langston University, which is an integrated university today. It was against the law in the 1950s. I'm a white man. If I had tried to attend Langston University, I would have been arrested because that was reserved for African Americans. And by the way, all over this country, including Oklahoma, including McIntosh County, African Americans were still being routinely lynched in the 1950s. I'm ancient, I know, but I was alive in the 1950s. This is what I'm describing to you happened during my young lifetime. In fact, in 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, that's 42 years after the Civil War. It's 42 years after the Reconstruction. When Oklahoma became a state, we wrote all of those Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow, that's segregation laws. We wrote all of those Jim Crow laws that had been passed in the southern states during the Reconstruction right into our state constitution. And even though we became a state 42 years after 42 years after the Civil War, we entered the Union as one of the most segregated states in history. The Oklahoma State Constitution said, and I quote, "Any teacher who shall willfully and knowingly allow any children of the colored race to attend the school maintained for the white race shall be fined and his certificate canceled for 1 year. It shall be unlawful for any white person to attend any school." That's why I couldn't go to Langston. This isn't the tradition, this is the law. It shall be unlawful for any white person to attend any school, college, or institution where colored pupils are received for instruction, end quote. In this state, like most of the South, we had segregated prisons, segregated institutions for the blind and deaf. They used to have a thing where they sent incorrigible young people, or young people that were considered incorrigible. Today they call it juvenile hall, maybe. Is that what they call it today? Juvie. I've heard people, well, it was called reform school in those days. And they were segregated. We had segregated insane asylums and tuberculosis sanitariums, and boating in this state was segregated. Fishing, there were only certain areas on Oklahoma lakes and rivers where black people could fish. Segregated swimming pools, I remember that. I'm old enough to remember that in Oklahoma. Beaches were segregated in Oklahoma. On a ballot, a state ballot, the race of the candidate, Black John Smith, and they wouldn't put black, they would put colored in parentheses. So you wouldn't accidentally vote for a black man for office. The race of the candidates had to be put on the ballot. Payphones were segregated. As I've said to you before, I think, right down here in McIntosh County Courthouse, probably Bibles. They had 2 Bibles, one for white witnesses to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God, and one for black witnesses to swear to the same thing. They were segregated waiting rooms, airports, bus stations, train stations were segregated. Buses and trains were segregated. Biracial marriages were illegal in the state of Oklahoma. If a white man married a black woman, or a black man married a white woman, the fine was $500. And you say, well, that's not much. That was a lot of money in 1950. In the 1950s, teachers were teaching for, and we were professionals. We had degrees. We were teaching for $1,200 or $1,300 a year. That's half a year's salary that you had to pay. Half a year's salary you had to pay if you married someone other than a member of your race, and you got 1 to 5 years in prison. Here are some instances of segregation. There's, of course, a lynching. There's 3 men. There's a dead man on the ground. It's a postcard. You see, they would lynch people, and they would have a photographer present. He would take pictures and sell them as postcards. Got these 2 people down. Interracial marriage did not become legal in this country until 1962. That's 100 years after the Battle of Antietam. And the case was the Loving case, Loving versus Virginia. And underline that, it's a Supreme Court case. 100 years after the Civil War, we finally got around to making interracial marriages legal. Write this woman down, Mrs. Clara Looper. She was a history teacher in an Oklahoma City school. Clara Looper. And she is an early day Oklahoma civil rights pioneer. Okay, leave it to the history teachers, I say. But she noticed in Oklahoma City that when her students broke for lunch, she was teaching, of course, in an all-black school. When her students broke for lunch, they had to walk 10 or 12 blocks away from the school to finally get to a restaurant that would serve them, because all of the other restaurants near the school and in downtown Oklahoma City were strictly segregated. So you know what a history lesson, you know what she started doing in her classes? She would call the roll and take the class down to a white restaurant, and they would go in and stage what was called, get this down, called a sit-in. They were very well dressed. They didn't curse and scream. They didn't destroy anything. They just sat there and asked to be served. Okay, sit-ins. We'll talk more about sit-ins later. You know, when Clara Looper was a little girl, her older brother died because a white doctor in the little Oklahoma town they lived in refused to treat him. Her father worked 2 extra jobs. He had his day job, and then he worked 2 extra jobs so he could buy his children clothes for the upcoming school year. And they would take a yearly trip to Tulsa. Well, that was a big event in their lives, to go to Tulsa. They would, and they would go shopping for school clothes. And do you know that they had to stand on the sidewalk? They could not go in the department store. They had to stand on the sidewalk, and the clerk, Mrs. Looper's mother, would have her children's shoe sizes written down, and would hand it to the clerk, and the clerk would go in and bring out several pairs of shoes, several pairs of size 7s, and they would look at them, and they couldn't touch them. They just had to point to the shoes that they wanted, and once they did, they took the box of shoes. The father paid for them, and they went home. You couldn't try the shoes on. You had to buy it as is, and if it didn't fit, too bad. Take it or leave it. And that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And she fought to change that. And her program, you know, this sit-in program that she inaugurates in Oklahoma City eventually led to the integration of downtown Oklahoma City restaurants. Okay, so she is an early day Oklahoma civil rights pioneer. I'll just show you how severe it was. Just an illustration, in 1956, the state legislature of Alabama considered making the sale, right here, you see that? That's a bottle of scotch, black and white scotch. And those are 2 little Scottish terriers. There's a black one and a white one, okay? Because it had a black and white dog sitting together on a bottle of scotch, okay? The state legislature of Alabama tried to make the selling. They almost passed it. I think it failed by just a few votes because people said how ridiculous. But most people didn't, or a lot of people didn't think it was ridiculous. They tried to stop the sale of black and white scotch because one of these dogs was white and one was black. That's how severe segregation was. And by the way, they did pass a law the same year they tried to outlaw the selling of black and white scotch, which would have been a pretty minor thing in the big picture. But the same year that failed to pass, the Alabama state legislature passed a bill asking for the United States government to give the state of Alabama enough money to remove the entire black population of the state of Alabama. Okay, they asked the Congress for that. Obviously, the Congress didn't grant them that money, but I'm just showing you the attitude, the racial attitudes. And these are not, the good old boys behind the general store. These are, you would think, elected state officials, government officials, maybe educated people, and they're making these horrible, horrible decisions. It shows their mindset. I guess that's what I'm trying to say to you. And by the way, it wasn't just in the South. I'm not picking on, it wasn't just in the South. At the same time that this is going on in the South, the New York Times refused to run pictures of African-American newlyweds. They would have a story and tell the story of the wedding, but they would not run pictures. And that's in liberal New York City. They would not, quote, liberal New York City. They would not run the pictures of African-American newlyweds. Well, in the 1950s, you're going to see the emergence of people like Rosa Parks to contest these awful things. And a young Baptist preacher I mentioned yesterday, 26 years old, Martin Luther King. They're going to spearhead the civil rights movement. But before them, get this down, before them, before Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., this man, well, let me show you these pictures here, if you can see them. There's a white man drinking out of a water fountain, and it says, you see, for colored only. I mean, I'm white. I could have, if I'd been there that day and I'd gone to this, I could have been arrested for drinking out of a fountain reserved for black people. There's a bus station or something. White people, you go this way to check in your luggage. Colored people, waiting room. We would be shocked to see that today. I think I told you earlier, when African Americans travel, if they went to a gas station to get gas and said we need to use the restroom, well, they would have three restrooms. One would say men, one would say women, and the third one would say colored. Okay, colored. And there is a quote colored waiting room. There's the Rex Theater for colored people, not white. There's a man drinking. You see, there's white men, colored men, colored waiting room, bus station. Help wanted, whites only. And there's a courthouse, and there's a boy outside a courthouse. Well, before Martin Luther King and before Rosa Parks, I want you to write this man down, Branch Rickey. Okay, Branch Rickey. He made a gigantic gesture toward, I think, equality. You know, the American people, and I don't criticize them one bit. I'm a sports fanatic myself. The American people are, sports are an integral, I can't say that word, integral part of American life. And we are avid sports people. Okay, I don't care if you're talking about the Super Bowl or the Texas OU game or Japan beating us yesterday in this baseball world competition. I didn't know such a thing existed until spring break, and I was flipping through and I saw Venezuela playing Cuba in baseball. I thought, my God, or England was playing someone in baseball. I thought, I didn't know they had a baseball team in England. But anyway, I guess it came down to last night, the championship, and the Japanese beat the United States. Of course, who introduced, we talked about this, who introduced baseball to Japan at the end of World War II? Douglas MacArthur. Okay, so we can blame General MacArthur. That's one of the things he did. But anyway, before these iconic civil rights leaders that we are all familiar with, Mr. Branch Rickey in 1947, okay, 1947, who was the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, he recruited an African American to play, and there he is, Jackie Robinson, writing down to play in Major League Baseball. And of course, the story is always that Jackie Robinson was the first African American to play Major League Baseball, and he wasn't. Here is the first, just to be on the technical side of things. Here's the first African American ever to play Major League Baseball. His name was Moses Fleetwood Walker, and there he is in a team picture with. There's another African American, but there he is in a team picture with his fellow white players. And he played in the pros. He played for the Toledo Blue Stockings, which is no longer a team, but in 1884 it was. So just to be technically correct, Fleetwood Walker, Moses Fleetwood Walker, was the first African American to play. But the most famous African American to break the color barrier, maybe he's more famous because he's closer to our day than Fleetwood Walker, but was Jackie Robinson. And he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Today there are no Brooklyn Dodgers. Today they're the Los Angeles Dodgers. Jack Roosevelt Robinson from the Negro League. Jack Roosevelt Robinson was born in Caney, Georgia in 1919. He was the grandson of a slave. He was the son of a sharecropper. And his father decided to move the family to Los Angeles to try and escape segregation and lynching and racism in Georgia. And they did move to Los Angeles, and Jackie Robinson worked hard in school. He was an excellent student, but he also worked hard on the field. A lot of times we divide that. You can be a great athlete or you can be a great student. No, guess what? You can be both. And there's a perfect example. He won a scholarship to UCLA. By the way, you talk about if you want a tremendous story, not fiction. People read fiction books. They're all going to read about how this person, that person didn't overcome anything. It's fiction. You want a real life, flesh and blood story of overcoming? Well, this man right here. He was the first athlete in the history of UCLA. I have a niece there now. She says it's an excellent school. He's the first athlete in the history of UCLA to win letters in 4 sports. You know, most people go to college and they play baseball, or they play basketball, or they run track, or they play lacrosse, or they play volleyball, or they play football. You know, they concentrate on that one sport. Well, guess what? He participated in 4 sports: track, baseball, and excelled, by the way. He wasn't just tagging along on the team. Track, baseball, football, and basketball. And in the spring of 1947, Branch Rickey brought him up to play in the major leagues. And that stunned the baseball world. But Rickey stood by his guns. He got a lot of criticism for that. In fact, Jackie Robinson, his own teammates, the Brooklyn Dodgers, all signed a petition saying, "We will not play with a black man." He played first base. I'll show you a little film clip of him sometime. He played first base. Every game he played, there were death threats. They threatened to shoot him from the stands. His wife would attend the games. They threatened to shoot his wife from the stands. Crowds roared their approval. When pitchers deliberately hit him, when he came up to bat, pitchers would hold the ball up to the crowd like that, just to symbolize, I'm going to hit him on the first pitch. And these are people throwing 100 miles an hour. This isn't junior league baseball. And they would hold that ball up and the crowd would just roar. And then the pitcher would break into a pitch and he would hit Robinson with the ball, throwing as hard as he could. Hotels and restaurants wouldn't serve him on the road. The rest of the team got to register in a hotel. He had to sleep on the bus. That must have been, to put it mildly, very discouraging. But again, if you want a story of overcoming, there's not one better than this. There's not one better than this. When the Brooklyn Dodgers, this integrated baseball team, the Brooklyn Dodgers, when they were scheduled to play another team, for example, when they were scheduled to play St. Louis, right up the road from where we are, the St. Louis Cardinals threatened to go on strike rather than play against an integrated baseball team. That's how deeply entrenched racism and segregation was in this country. And by the way, everything I've told you so far, it was all legal. And it all went back to a case in 1896, get this down, the thing that legalized segregation, the thing that gave the states the right to segregate anything they wanted to. 1896, the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson. It said the states could segregate anything they wanted, and segregate the states did. Sort of like the Supreme Court on the abortion issue. Abortion was a right guaranteed to women from 1972 until 2021 or 2022, I guess 2022, 50 years, okay? And, the Supreme Court didn't outlaw abortion. They simply said, we're going to send it back to the states. And many, many states, including the one you're living in, they have outlawed abortion. Okay, but the court said, we didn't do away with abortion, we just gave the states the power to do it. Well, this is a very different issue, of course, segregation, but sort of like what the court did. The court said that the states could segregate anything they wanted as long as the facilities were equal. That's why in Eufaula, Oklahoma, until the 1960s, until 100 years after the Civil War ended, Eufaula, Oklahoma had 2 schools, one black school called Booker T. Washington, and one white school called Eufaula High School. And that was the case all over the country, but especially in the southern states. Well, in 1954, again, we're talking about the Eisenhower administration. And remember, Eisenhower becomes president in 1953. I told you that people tended to look back in the 50s as this calm period where nothing really significant happened. I hope I've disabused you of that notion. Because you can see here all the way from the Vietnam War, you can see here all sorts of major events are occurring in the 1950s. The arms race, the nuclear arms race, the space race, all those things are going on during Eisenhower. It's a very dangerous and troubled period of American history. But that all segregation began to change. You know, if we walked today, went to a restaurant and it said whites only, we would drop our teeth on the sidewalk. Well, how did that change? Because I've tried to describe to you how in my lifetime, how deeply entrenched racism and segregation was. And so how did we get in just one lifetime, 50 years, 60 years, how did we get from that to where we are today? Well, the beginning point of that is a case that was decided by the Supreme Court that overturned Plessy. Well, that's not exactly true. 1954, it is the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education. And underline that, that's a Supreme Court case. I just made a mistake. I said it overturned Plessy. It overturned Plessy in one area because Brown, get this down, Brown is only about one area of American life, and that is education. That is education. The Brown case said that segregation in education was illegal, but that was it, illegal, okay? Well, I'm gonna stop there today, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to take a look a little bit in depth. We're gonna take a look at the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. I want you to know more about it, that it outlawed segregation of the schools. It's much, much bigger than that. So we'll see that come tomorrow. Well, perfect.